Everyone in line laughed when the frail, older woman asked for a military discount at the hardware store. But when the young cashier caught a glimpse of something inked on her weathered forearm, a Medal of Honor tattoo, the entire room fell silent. That moment would not only change how people saw her, but how they saw their own understanding of courage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Henderson didn't look like a war hero. Standing just a little over 5 feet, with hunched shoulders and silver-streaked hair pulled back into a simple clip, she blended into most places, with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding attention. Her clothes were plain: tan slacks, a faded windbreaker, and worn-out sneakers with the sole on the right foot peeling just slightly at the heel. At first glance, she was just another quiet, elderly woman living alone in a modest town, trying to stretch every penny of her fixed retirement income. Most people assumed she was perhaps a widow of someone who'd served. No one ever guessed that she was the one with battlefield scars, both seen and unseen. Her morning had started like most others. She woke at dawn, brewed a small cup of black coffee, and fed her old Labrador Samson. The air was crisp that morning, and the leaves in Silver Ridge had just begun to hint at autumn, a town small enough for everyone to know your face, but not always your story. Clara had lived there for the last 9 years, quietly keeping to herself in a small brick cottage on the edge of town. She rarely ventured out except for errands, doctor's appointments, and her weekly visit to the community garden, where she tended a tiny patch of wildflowers planted in honor of someone no one else remembered anymore. That day, she needed to replace a broken handle on her kitchen cabinet, a small job, but one she refused to leave undone. Clara had always believed in taking care of things herself, a habit deeply ingrained during years in environments where self-reliance wasn't a choice, but a necessity. So she gathered her small list of supplies, slipped a $20 bill into her pocket, and walked the 2.5 blocks to Miller's Hardware, the same store her neighbor's kids often worked summer shifts at. Miller's was busy that morning, with contractors grabbing supplies for job sites and weekend warriors loading up for projects. Clara made her way through the aisles slowly, checking prices and mentally calculating what she could afford. She picked up a drawer handle, a tiny tin of wood filler, and a small bottle of industrial glue, just enough to make the fix last a few more years. When she stepped into the checkout line, she found herself sandwiched between 2 groups of men, talking loudly over her head. One wore a shirt with the logo of a local plumbing company. The other, college-aged, had clearly just come from the gym, still in sweats and earbuds half dangling. Clara waited patiently as the line inched forward. Her presence went mostly unnoticed, as usual. She was used to it. The way society quietly erased women past a certain age. The way she became invisible as soon as her hair turned white. She didn't mind. Attention had never been something she craved. But what came next still managed to sting in a way she hadn't expected. When it was finally her turn at the counter, she set down her items and asked in her soft, raspy voice if the store still offered a military discount. The young man behind the register, no older than 19, pale with a dusting of freckles and a nervous energy, glanced up from the monitor, confused. Before he could answer, one of the men behind her scoffed. "Oh, come on, lady," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for others to hear. "Military discount? For what?" "Knitting battalions." A few snickers followed. Another voice added something about bingo nights in the Army Reserves. Clara didn't turn around. Her eyes remained on the cashier, whose fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard. She could feel the flush rise in her cheeks, that same old heat of shame and frustration that always surfaced when people made assumptions. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last, but today, for some reason, it cut a little deeper. Heck, shame. She began to reach for her wallet, intending to pay in full without another word. But as she shifted her sleeve to dig out the bill folded in her pocket, her left forearm turned slightly toward the light, just enough for the young cashier to see the faint outline of something inked into her skin. His eyes narrowed. He leaned in slightly, his confusion quickly replaced by something sharper: recognition. On Clara's forearm, worn but unmistakable, was a tattoo of the Medal of Honor. Not decorative, not a novelty, but the exact emblem awarded only to those who had demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The tattoo was faded, yes, and partially obscured by the sleeve, but it was there. And for those who knew what they were looking at, it meant something extraordinary. Tibiaki. The cashier's face changed, his posture stiffened. For a split second he didn't know what to say. The voices behind her died down, replaced by an odd sort of silence. Clara, still unaware of what the boy had seen, continued fishing through her wallet with shaky fingers. It wasn't until he quietly asked her to hold on that she paused, looking up in confusion. "Ma'am," he said softly, could you wait here just one moment?" Without waiting for an answer, he stepped away from the counter and disappeared into the back room. A few more murmurs rippled through the line. The man who had made the bingo joke shifted uncomfortably. One of the others craned his neck, trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on. Clara stood there, items on the counter, heart-pounding for reasons she couldn't fully explain. It had been years since anyone had noticed, really noticed, who she was, let alone acknowledged it. She didn't expect praise. She certainly didn't want it. But that small act of being seen, truly seen, was something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. And it was about to spark a chain of events no one in that store, including Clara, could have predicted. Clara stood motionless, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above, blending with the low rustle of shifting feet and awkward silence behind her. The young cashier had disappeared into the back room with such urgency, and yet she didn't quite know why. The puzzled expressions of the men waiting in line did little to clarify things, though their earlier smirks had curdled into something more uncertain. The man who had cracked the bingo battalion joke was now staring at the floor, his hands in his pockets, his posture more slouched than defiant. Clara didn't look at him. She simply stood there, not out of pride or discomfort, but out of years of discipline that had taught her the strength of stillness. She'd learned long ago that sometimes silence held more power than any words could. Minutes stretched on like molasses. She glanced toward the door the boy had gone through, half wondering if perhaps something was wrong with the register system, or if he'd needed a manager's approval for her discount after all. She hadn't expected the laugh, but neither had she expected to be taken seriously. She never asked for the discount out of entitlement, only because someone once told her she'd earned it. But each time she requested it, it felt like exposing a part of herself that no longer fit in the civilian world, like offering a piece of armor to people who had no idea what battle it had seen. She sometimes questioned why she still bothered at all. Was it really about saving a few dollars, or was it a quiet act of resistance, a subtle refusal to be erased? The door behind the counter creaked open and the boy reappeared, but he wasn't alone. A broad-shouldered man with thinning gray hair and a neatly pressed navy blue shirt bearing the name Dennis, stitched over the breast pocket, followed close behind. Clara recognized him, the store manager, perhaps even the owner. He had the face of someone who had once been tough, but had mellowed with time. His eyes scanned the small group near the register, then landed on Clara with laser-like focus. She saw something shift behind them, confusion at first, then dawning realization, and then a somber kind of respect. He stepped forward, not quickly, but with deliberate purpose, and gestured toward the young cashier, who now stood quietly beside the register. The manager spoke softly to Clara, almost reverently, his voice low and careful. There were no grand declarations, no embarrassing questions, just a simple, respectful acknowledgement of who she was. And then, without making a show of it, he turned to the register, tapped in a series of codes, and quietly told her that not only would her purchase be fully discounted, but anything else she might need today would be on the house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Clara blinked. It wasn't the free items that surprised her. It was the way his eyes never flinched, never searched for confirmation beyond what he already believed. He hadn't asked for proof. He hadn't doubted her. He had simply looked at her, really looked, and accepted that sometimes what a person carries inside is more real than any documentation. She gave a tiny nod, murmured a soft thank you, and turned to leave, her paper bag of items tucked gently under her arm. As she moved through the automatic doors and stepped back into the cool morning air, she didn't look back. But behind her, a different kind of silence lingered in the hardware store. Not the awkward kind that follows embarrassment, but the kind that sinks in when people realize they've just witnessed something much bigger than they expected. Word spread fast in Silver Ridge. By the time Clara had reached her cottage, a few blocks away, the story had already made its way into 3 separate group chats, 2 private Facebook messages, and 1 short video clip that someone from the checkout line had managed to discreetly record. Clara didn't know it yet, but her simple trip to Miller's Hardware would ripple out across her small town, and eventually, far beyond it. For now, she was simply relieved to be home. She let Samson out into the yard, set her bag down on the kitchen counter, and began preparing the tools she'd need to fix the broken cabinet. The task itself was small, but the act of doing it grounded her. It reminded her she was still capable, still here, still building something, even if just a small repair in a quiet kitchen no one else ever saw. That afternoon, as she sat on her porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, she finally noticed something strange. A car had driven past her house 3 times in the last half hour. Not unusual for a busy neighborhood, except her street was a dead end, and the same silver SUV had no business looping back. She squinted against the sun, watching as it circled once more before finally parking across the street. A woman stepped out, early 30s, stylish in a casual way, with a press badge clipped to her side and a notepad in hand. Clara sighed, immediately sensing what this was. Someone must have tipped the local paper. Perhaps it was the boy at the register, or someone else in the store. She didn't blame them. People loved a good story, especially one that let them feel better about the world. But Clara hadn't told her own story in years. Not fully, not publicly. The last time she'd tried, it had been twisted into something that made her uncomfortable, like a photo taken at the wrong angle. Still, she stood as the woman approached the porch. The reporter introduced herself, Elise Marsh, from the Silver Ridge Daily Chronicle, and politely asked if Clara might be willing to speak for a short feature piece. "Just something local," she said, "in honor of Veterans Week." Clara studied her face, noting the earnestness behind her eyes. She didn't see any signs of exploitation there, only curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, a desire to get something right for once. She considered declining, but something in her gut told her it was time. Time to stop living like her past needed to be hidden. Time to show people that not all warriors wore helmets and carried rifles. Some carried grief and memory and strength in silence. So she invited Elise up to the porch and offered her a seat. Over the next hours, she spoke quietly but clearly, answering the woman's questions with a kind of unflinching candor. She told her how she had served in the Tactical Air Control Party, one of the first women integrated into field command roles during high-stakes operations overseas. How she had refused promotions so she could stay with her team. How she had pulled 2 fellow soldiers from the wreckage of a bombed-out village despite being injured herself. How she had been awarded the Medal of Honor in a closed-door ceremony that had received little press because the military wasn't sure how the country would respond to a woman receiving its highest honor at the time. How she had quietly walked away from the service after her final deployment, not because she couldn't continue, but because she had seen enough loss to last 10 lifetimes. Elise sat in silence for long moments after Clara finished. There were no more questions. Just a soft, almost reverent, "thank you," before she stood to leave. Clara watched her go, unsure what would come next. She had opened a door that had long remained locked, and now, for better or worse, the truth was out. But Clara had no idea just how far that truth would travel, or how deeply it would change the people who heard it. The next morning began like any other, with the quiet drip of Clara's old coffee maker and the muffled sound of Samson's nails clicking against the kitchen tile as he waited patiently by his bowl. Clara moved with her usual efficiency, steady, unhurried, methodical. She had always found comfort in routines, the small, predictable tasks that bookended each day. For decades, her life had thrived on precision, and even now, long after she'd hung up her uniform, the discipline lingered like muscle memory. She opened the kitchen window to let in the scent of pine and cool dew, unaware that the world outside her home was already shifting in response to the story she had shared. Across town, in the offices of the Silver Ridge Daily Chronicle, Elise Marsh was already fielding dozens of emails. She had published the article just before midnight, scheduling it to go live at 6 a.m. sharp, timed to coincide with the beginning of the town's annual Veterans Week. What she hadn't anticipated was the tidal wave of response. The piece, titled "The Medal She Never Mentioned, Clara Henderson's Quiet Bravery," had not only gained traction in Silver Ridge, it was spreading like wildfire across the state and then nationally. Within hours, regional outlets had picked it up, quoting lines, sharing the image Elise had snapped of Clara seated on her porch, sunlight casting soft shadows across her deeply lined face, her Medal of Honor tattoo just barely visible below her rolled sleeve. The photo wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It captured something deeper than heroism. It captured dignity. By noon, Elise had turned off all her phone notifications. Veterans groups, military historians, television producers, and everyday readers flooded her inbox. Some sent long messages, describing their own experiences with forgotten heroes in their families. Others simply wrote, "Thank you for telling her story." There was one email, however, that stood out. It came from a man named Captain Mason Wilder, a retired Army officer now working at the National Military Service Museum in Washington, D.C. His message was short, but carried weight. "We've been trying to track down Sergeant Major Clara Henderson for years. Please confirm if this is the same woman. We would like to honor her publicly, properly, if she is willing." Elise stared at the message for a long time, rereading it twice, then 3 times. There had been a quiet intensity in Clara's voice when she recounted her service, a kind of restrained vulnerability, and Elise hadn't pressed her beyond what she was willing to share. But now, a much larger spotlight loomed and she wasn't sure if Clara would want it. Still, something in her gut told her Clara deserved the choice, not silence, not invisibility. A choice. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her modest living room, completely unaware of the whirlwind swirling just beyond her property line. She didn't own a smartphone. Her old desktop computer, dusty and temperamental, hadn't been turned on in weeks. She preferred books to screens, quiet evenings to digital noise. So when her landline rang at 1:03 p.m., she answered it with the same calm voice she always used. It was Elise, and her tone was careful but urgent. She explained what had happened: the article going viral, the national attention, the museum's inquiry. She assured Clara that she hadn't shared any personal contact details, only that someone had finally seen the story and recognized its importance. Clara didn't speak for a long moment. Elise waited, giving her space. When Clara finally answered, her voice was even, but there was a subtle tremor beneath it. Not fear, not regret, just gravity. She told Elise she needed time to think. Not days, just a night. Elise agreed, and they ended the call on a quiet, mutual understanding. That evening, Clara sat alone on the edge of her bed, a folded shoebox in her lap. It was old, the cardboard edges soft and worn, the lid loose from years of opening and closing. Inside were fragments of a life few people had ever known about. A crumpled photograph of her unit, taken days before the ambush. A tarnished compass with her initials carved on the back. A strip of sand-colored cloth, stained with something darker. And beneath it all, a laminated slip of paper, a brief, impersonal commendation from her Medal of Honor ceremony, signed but never spoken aloud in any room filled with press or podiums. She had never displayed the medal itself. It sat in a small velvet box at the bottom of her dresser drawer, even when the others had encouraged her to let the world know. Back when she still attended reunion dinners and strategy symposiums, she had always declined, not because she didn't value the recognition, but because the weight of it never felt like hers alone. It belonged to those who hadn't come home, to the ones whose names were etched on walls or buried under the silence of classified missions. Speaking about it felt like taking up space they couldn't. But tonight, something had shifted. She had spent her life shrinking into corners, believing that humility required invisibility. Yet perhaps humility meant standing anyway, not for herself, but for every woman who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or disbelieved. For every young soldier who had been told their bravery was only valid if someone noticed. For the store cashier who had looked at her and seen past the wrinkles and whispery voice to something solid and enduring. The next morning, Clara called Elise and said simply, "Let's talk about DC." Within a week, arrangements had begun. Captain Wilder and his team coordinated logistics, working alongside representatives from the Department of Defense and the Women in Uniform Foundation. News of the recognition ceremony, a long overdue public honoring of one of the nation's most quietly decorated veterans, began making its way into official schedules. Invitations were extended to past unit members, select journalists, and Clara's extended family, though she hadn't spoken to many of them in years. Her niece in Colorado cried when she answered the phone, apologizing for not calling sooner and promising to be there front row. As the ceremony approached, Clara remained calm, but her days grew heavier with memory. She found herself walking more slowly, pausing longer at the photo on the mantel. A picture of her and Lieutenant Marissa Cole, her best friend and field partner, who hadn't made it home from their final mission. Clara spoke to the photo sometimes, quietly, like a prayer or confession. She asked if this was okay, if stepping forward now, after so many years, was selfish or brave. And though no voice ever answered, something in the silence gave her permission. On the day of her departure for Washington, Clara stepped out of her house dressed, not in ceremonial uniform, but in the same windbreaker and slacks she'd worn to the hardware store. She carried a small duffel, her items packed with military precision, and paused only to scratch Samson behind the ears before a neighbor arrived to take him for the week. As she climbed into the car sent by the foundation, she glanced once more at her cottage, the place that had kept her safe and hidden for so long. It was time for the world to see the woman it had overlooked. And for Clara, it was time to reclaim the truth she had buried, not for validation, but to give voice to those whose courage still lived in silence. The car ride to the airport was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. The driver, a kind-eyed woman named Rosa, worked for the Women in Uniform Foundation and had clearly been briefed not to treat Clara like some fragile relic. She simply asked once if Clara needed anything, then drove the rest of the way with gentle music playing low from the dashboard, a soft mix of piano and strings that let Clara's thoughts wander freely. As they passed through the outskirts of Silver Ridge, Clara watched the trees slip by in a blur of late autumn colors: gold, amber, deep rust. The season was changing fast, as if the earth itself sensed it was time to shed the past. At the airport, everything had been arranged down to the last detail: no lines, no crowds. A quiet escort through a private security checkpoint, followed by a short wait in a reserved lounge where uniformed personnel she didn't know greeted her with a mix of awe and reverence. Clara found it surreal. For decades, she had boarded flights unnoticed, walked through terminals without a second glance. Today, however, she was a name on a list, a guest of honor, and people looked at her as if they were trying to match her face to something legendary. She didn't quite know what to do with their gratitude. It made her hands fidget. She folded them into her lap and focused instead on the sound of the announcements echoing through the terminal. The flight was smooth. The flight attendant assigned to her row treated her not with condescension, but with gentle dignity, offering her tea and blankets, never once asking invasive questions. Clara sat by the window and stared out at the sky, letting the hum of the engines lull her into a half-doze filled with fragments of memory. A flash of desert sun, the metallic ring of radio static, the way Marissa used to hum under her breath while checking maps, the dull weight of body armor, the sound of her own heartbeat when the dust settled, and she realized she was the only one left standing. She had spent years learning how to live around these moments, not forgetting them, but compartmentalizing them so they didn't overwhelm her. But now, flying toward Washington, toward recognition, they returned with sharp clarity. She didn't resist. She welcomed them, each image a bead in the rosary of her life. When the plane touched down, a team from the Department of Defense met her at the gate. They didn't overwhelm her with fanfare, just respectful nods and quiet coordination. A black SUV was waiting at the curb, and Clara was driven to a stately hotel just a few blocks from the National Military Service Museum. Her suite was modest, but tasteful, and a folder on the desk inside contained her itinerary for the next 2 days. A dress rehearsal in the Hall of Valor, a dinner with Foundation board members, and then the ceremony itself, a public event streamed nationally and attended by dignitaries, veterans, and military families. Clara closed the folder and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the carpet for a long while. She felt like she had entered someone else's life, and part of her wondered when she'd wake up in her cottage, Samson nudging her hand for breakfast, but this was real. And tomorrow, she would be standing at a podium where so many had stood before her, men with medals and memoirs, men with booming voices and lines of reporters hanging on their words. Clara didn't want to speak for the cameras. She only wanted to speak for the silence, for all the things that had never been said because no one thought to ask. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the glass skyline of the city, Clara was escorted to a private dinner hosted by the Women in Uniform Foundation. The room was filled with servicewomen of every rank and branch, many of them decades younger than Clara, their faces filled with admiration and, in some cases, something deeper, more personal. A kind of recognition that spanned generations. As Clara took her seat, the conversations quieted for a moment. Not because she had demanded attention, but because her presence was enough. The dinner itself was warm, informal, filled with laughter and quiet toasts. Women shared stories of field missions and policy battles, of being underestimated and overlooked, of making space where none had been offered. Clara listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, the room leaned in. Her words were never dramatic. She didn't exaggerate. She simply told the truth as she had lived it, plainly, but with conviction. She described the early years, the resistance, the solitude, how she had led not by demanding loyalty, but by showing up, again and again, in the most dangerous places, refusing to abandon her post, even when it would have been easy to disappear. Later that night, a young woman named Sergeant Kira Maxwell approached her with trembling hands and asked if she could sit beside her. Clara nodded, and Kira took a breath before telling her that just last year she had been passed over for a promotion despite outperforming her male counterparts, that she had questioned whether she belonged, that some days she felt invisible, just another uniform, another name tag, another cog in the wheel, and that reading Clara's story had stopped her from submitting her resignation. Clara said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small pin, a silver leaf, smooth and worn from years of being carried. "This belonged to Marissa," she said softly, pressing it into the young woman's hand. "She never made it home. But she led with grace, even when no one believed in her. Carry it for her, and for yourself." Kira's eyes welled, but she nodded, holding the pin like a sacred object. Clara didn't need to say more. The weight of history had already spoken for her. The next morning, Clara rose early and stood before the mirror in her hotel suite. She didn't wear a dress uniform. She wore a navy blazer, a simple blouse, and pressed trousers. On her lapel, she pinned the Medal of Honor. Not in the center, not in glittering display, but nestled close to her heart where it had always lived. Her reflection stared back at her with a quiet steadiness. Wrinkles carved deep, eyes both tired and unwavering. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had done what was necessary, and then kept on living when it was over. When the car arrived to take her to the museum, Clara stepped into it without ceremony. She wasn't thinking about the cameras or the audience. She was thinking about her unit, about Marissa, about every soldier who had never gotten a ceremony. She was there for them, not to speak their names out of obligation, but to remind the world that they had existed, that they had mattered. And as she neared the Hall of Valor, where her name would finally be etched into history, Clara didn't feel fear or pride. She felt ready. The National Military Service Museum stood tall and regal beneath the crisp morning sky, its marble columns glowing pale gold as the sun climbed higher over Washington. Flags fluttered gently along the curved walkway leading to its entrance, each one bearing the emblem of a different branch of the armed forces. A modest crowd had already begun gathering along the steps and walkways, not the kind that jostled with frenzy, but the kind that stood with quiet reverence, reading placards, straightening ties, and speaking in hushed tones as if aware they were on sacred ground. Inside the Hall of Valor, the air was thick with a particular stillness, the kind reserved for remembering. The walls bore names etched into metal and stone, a constellation of legacies that stretched back more than a century. Beneath each name lay a story of bravery, sacrifice, courage in the face of unspeakable odds. And soon, another name would join them, Clara Henderson. Clara stepped through the private entrance at the side of the museum, flanked by two military officials in dress uniform, who offered her only quiet nods and the occasional guiding gesture. She moved deliberately, her gait steady, though her knees whispered reminders of years long past. Her blazer fit snugly across her shoulders, and the Medal of Honor rested with solemn gravity against her chest. No one reached for her. No one fussed. The moment was hers to own, and they all knew it. She didn't need help. She never had. She entered the hall through a velvet-curtained archway and paused for a breath. The room before her was arranged in quiet elegance. Rows of folding chairs arranged before a small stage with a lectern, all beneath the museum's great skylight that bathed the space in natural light. On either side of the stage, two large projection screens displayed the same image, a monochrome portrait of a young Clara, taken during her years of active duty. Her eyes in the photo were intense, sharp, almost defiant, her jaw set in determination. Few would have guessed it was the same woman now standing there, decades later, hair silver and shoulders softer, but with that same undercurrent of steel running through her spine. She was ushered to a seat in the front row, where she found a name placard waiting for her. Around her sat an assembly of dignitaries, veterans, servicewomen, and quietly weeping strangers. Some held programs folded in their laps. Others simply stared at her with awe, their expressions full of the gratitude words could never properly express. As she settled into her seat, a voice whispered behind her, not to her, but audible enough to hear, "She's the one. That's her." The ceremony began promptly at 10. The museum's director opened with a welcome, her voice poised but warm as she spoke of legacy and service. She referenced the long overdue nature of the morning's recognition, citing a need to acknowledge not just what Clara had done, but what she had represented. A woman who had served not in support, but on the front lines, who had been recommended for the Medal of Honor not once but twice. whose commendation had been buried in bureaucratic uncertainty, whose story had been passed over in newsrooms for lack of public interest in non-traditional heroism. There were moments of silence, and then moments of thunderous applause. Following the director's speech, a retired general took the stage, a tall, stoic man whose name Clara remembered from old reports. His voice was gravelly, but carried well. He spoke not only of Clara's bravery on the battlefield, but of the systems she had challenged without fanfare, the silent barriers she had walked through simply by surviving. He read aloud her medal citation, now officially updated and reissued, describing the events of that fateful mission overseas. He recounted how Clara, already wounded, had extracted 2 soldiers from an active fire zone, established communications in hostile terrain under radio blackout, coordinated an emergency airlift, and refused to leave until every member of her unit had been accounted for, living or dead. He detailed the injuries she sustained, the days she spent in field care refusing morphine to remain alert, the leadership she had demonstrated when command had fractured under pressure. Each word landed in the room like a hammer on stone, shaping a legacy long hidden. When he finished, he stepped aside, and the room fell still once again. Agro. It was time. Clara stood slowly, her legs sore but sure. She ascended the steps of the small stage without assistance, each movement deliberate, each step echoing lightly in the chamber. She reached the lectern, adjusted the microphone slightly, and looked out over the crowd. She took her time. The silence that followed was not tense, but full, expectant, respectful, almost sacred. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, raspy with age, but unwavering. She didn't thank anyone by name. She didn't offer anecdotes or polished quotes. She spoke plainly, as she always had, beginning with the simplest truth. I never thought I'd be standing here. Not because I didn't earn this, but because I assumed the world had already forgotten. She went on to talk about Marissa, about the ones who hadn't come home, about the women who had been written out of their own stories. She talked about what it meant to be invisible, to walk into hardware stores and be laughed at, to apply for home loans and be asked if her husband had served, to hear medals described with only masculine pronouns, as though courage were a gendered thing. She did not speak with bitterness, but with clarity. Each sentence felt chiseled from stone, each pause deliberate. I carried this medal in my dresser drawer for years, because I didn't know what to do with it, she said. It didn't feel like mine. It felt like a weight I hadn't earned alone. But I've come to realize we never earn these things alone. We carry them for each other. And maybe, if enough people start paying attention, we can carry something else too. A little more understanding, a little more room for stories like mine. There were no standing ovations, no clapping interruptions, just silence. Powerful, steady, reverent silence, followed only by the rising swell of applause when she stepped away from the podium. Not rushed, not coaxed, but finished. After the ceremony, a museum curator led Clara to the far wall of the Hall of Valor, where a space had been prepared beside other recent inductees. There, beneath the glinting light, a new plaque had been mounted. It read simply, Sergeant Major Clara Henderson, United States Tactical Air Control Party, Medal of Honor recipient, for bravery beyond measure and service beyond praise. She stared at it for a long moment, her name in metal, her story, now permanent. She reached out and touched the edge of the plaque with 2 fingers, tracing the letters like a prayer. Behind her, the crowd slowly dispersed. Photos were taken, interviews requested, but Clara quietly declined. She had said what needed to be said. The rest could echo without her. That evening, as the sky turned violet over Washington, Clara returned to her hotel and stood at the window, watching the lights flicker on across the city. She felt no sudden swell of emotion, no cinematic rush. What she felt was a quiet kind of peace, like something long buried had finally been given air. Her story had been witnessed. Her name had been spoken. and the silence had finally been broken. Back in Silver Ridge, the town Clara had once believed would let her live out. Her days in quiet anonymity was beginning to stir with a newfound energy. The local paper's online version had added a dedicated banner, "Our Hometown Hero," full coverage of Clara Henderson's recognition. Students in nearby schools were assigned essays about her life. The mayor scheduled a community event in her honor, complete with a commemorative plaque for the town square, and a promise to create an annual scholarship for women pursuing military careers. Even the hardware store, the same one where this new chapter of her story had quietly begun, placed a framed photo of Clara near the register, a small hand-lettered sign beside it that simply read, "Thank you for your service, Clara. We'll never laugh again." But Clara, for her part, didn't rush back to any of it. She stayed in Washington a few more days, not as a guest of honor, but as a quiet observer. The museum offered her private access to its archives, and she took slow, deliberate walks through its corridors. She spent time in the wings dedicated to women in wartime, quietly studying photos of other faces like hers. Solemn, fierce, often forgotten. She listened to the audio recordings of oral histories, eyes closed, nodding, as familiar voices echoed her own buried memories. She jotted notes in a small spiral-bound notebook, sometimes writing down phrases, other times just moments. Not everything she heard was heroic. Some of it was mundane, tragic, or unfinished. But all of it was real, and it stirred something deeper in her, not grief exactly, but a kind of yearning. A pull toward something she hadn't expected to feel again, purpose. On her final morning in the city, she met with a woman named Dr. Lillian Kawehi, a military psychologist and archivist who oversaw the museum's Oral Legacy Division. Lillian had introduced herself briefly at the ceremony, but now invited Clara to breakfast at a quiet cafe nestled between row houses in Georgetown. Over eggs and coffee, she explained a new initiative the museum was developing, a program that aimed to collect personal testimonies from veterans who had never spoken publicly about their service. "There are thousands of untold stories," Lillian said, her voice calm and thoughtful, "especially from women. Especially from people who served in roles that history tends to blur. We want to preserve them. Accurately. Compassionately. Truthfully. And we need guides. People who understand both the silence and the sound of memory when it finally breaks loose." Clara listened, stirring her coffee slowly. It had been years since anyone had asked her to contribute to something larger than herself. And yet, this didn't feel like being pulled back into duty. It felt like being invited into a circle she had always belonged to, but never known how to enter. She didn't answer right away. She told Lillian she would need time to think. But she left with the museum's contact packet tucked neatly into her bag, and with something in her chest that felt suspiciously like hope. The flight home was uneventful, but Clara felt different stepping off the plane. The airport felt smaller now, the world more intimate. When she arrived back in Silver Ridge, Sampson was waiting, bounding out of the neighbor's truck with a happy bark and tail wag that nearly knocked her over. She knelt beside him, burying her hands in his thick coat, letting him slobber on her jacket without a care. For all the recognition she had received, this was the moment that felt most grounding, returning to a creature who loved her without needing headlines to justify it. Her home had been left just as she'd kept it. Plants watered, windows locked, the kitchen still smelling faintly of cedar oil. Yet something intangible had changed. Not the house itself, but the way it felt to stand inside it. The walls didn't press in quite so tightly now. The silence didn't echo so deeply. She spent the first evening unpacking slowly, folding each item with care, placing her blazer and metal box back in the drawer, not buried beneath other things this time, but on top. Not a secret, just a possession, something earned. Box B. The next morning brought visitors. First Elise, holding a small bouquet of sunflowers and a grin that couldn't be contained. They sat on the porch and talked for over an hour about the article's continued traction, the national interviews still coming in, and Elise's growing inbox of messages from young women across the country who had read Clara's story and written to say, "I didn't think people like me were allowed to be brave until I saw her." Clara didn't know how to respond to that. She only nodded, her throat tight, and offered Elise more coffee. Later came the mayor, with 2 council members and a framed certificate declaring November 12th, Clara Henderson Day, in Silver Ridge. Clara accepted it with grace, but asked if, instead of a parade or banquet, they might consider hosting a community volunteer day at the Veterans Support Shelter instead. The mayor blinked, clearly unprepared for such a request, but agreed without hesitation. Clara didn't want to be put on a pedestal. She wanted her story to matter, to ripple into something actionable, something living. The final visitor that day arrived late in the afternoon, a young man named Marcus, the cashier from the hardware store. He stood awkwardly at her front gate holding a paper bag and a sheepish smile. Clara recognized him instantly. She rose from her porch chair and walked down to meet him, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp with memory. Marcus cleared his throat and apologized, not just for the laugh, but for not knowing, for assuming, for being one more person who had looked and failed to see. He handed her the bag, explaining that it was from the whole staff, a set of brand new tools, a gift card, and a handwritten letter of thanks from every employee. Clara accepted it with a nod, then gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not mad," she said, her voice low but steady. "You didn't laugh to be cruel. You laughed because we don't teach people what strength really looks like." He swallowed hard, then nodded, and she saw in his face the beginning of something changing, not just in him, but in how he might treat the next customer who looked like her. That evening, Clara walked her property as the sky turned pink and gold. She moved slowly, letting Samson roam ahead, his tail swishing through the long grass. The air was cool, the wind soft. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was hiding behind her gate, waiting for the world to pass her by. She felt present, seen, not in the way of celebrity or spectacle, but in the deeper way that matters, seen as whole, complex, unfinished, still growing. She returned to the porch and sat with her notebook, flipping through the pages she had filled at the museum. At the very back she found a blank sheet and, after a moment's pause, began to write. Not a speech, not a biography, just fragments. Memories, feelings, questions. A story forming itself in real time, a witness arriving on paper, sieging. And as the sun dipped below the ridge, Clara kept writing. The days that followed drifted into a rhythm again, though not quite the same as before. Clara's mornings were still marked by the reliable sputter of the coffee pot and Samson's tail thudding softly against the cabinet doors as he waited for breakfast. But now there was a layer of something else overlaying her routines, an awareness that the world had finally turned its gaze toward her, not as a spectacle, but as a symbol. Yet even with that awareness came no arrogance. Clara didn't walk with her chin lifted or look at neighbors as if she expected deference. She still swept her own porch, still picked weeds from her flower beds, still ran errands in town without makeup and with her sleeves rolled casually to her elbows. The difference now was in how people responded. They looked her in the eye, they asked real questions, they listened longer. There was no more condescension in their voices, no veiled disbelief when she mentioned her service. Somehow a mutual truth had been established. Clara Henderson had always been who she said she was. It had simply taken the rest of them time to catch up. One morning, as she was walking Samson past the Silver Ridge High School football field, a group of students in JROTC uniforms came jogging by. One of them, a girl no older than 16 with tightly braided hair and scuffed boots, broke rank and jogged over, asking breathlessly if she could shake Clara's hand. Her name was Janelle, and she was writing an essay on women in combat for her senior capstone. Clara asked her to walk a while, and the two of them strolled in the shade while Samson sniffed along the fence. Clara asked questions more than she gave answers. What drew Janelle to military service? What did she want to do? What did she fear? The girl spoke with the unfiltered honesty of someone who hadn't yet been taught to armor her words. She was terrified of not being taken seriously, terrified of being just another number. Clara listened and finally told her this: "You don't have to be loud to be powerful, but you do have to be unshakable in who you are." Janelle blinked, nodded, and asked if she could quote that in her paper. Clara smiled and told her to make sure she didn't forget the part about being kind, too. Power without kindness was just noise. That same week, Elise called with an update. The museum had formally invited Clara to participate in their oral history initiative. Not just as a contributor, but as a mentor. They were piloting a new digital storytelling platform to capture the experiences of underrepresented veterans across the country. Women, minorities, LGBTQ service members, people who'd served in combat zones long before it was politically convenient to acknowledge them. Elise had already volunteered to help with logistics and video work, and the foundation had offered a grant to support Clara's involvement. Clara's first instinct was to say no, not because she wasn't interested, but because something in her still flinched at the idea of being seen so fully, so often. But then she remembered Janelle, and the girls like her who might never believe they belonged unless someone like Clara went first, so she said yes. Her first session was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in a quiet studio space on the second floor of the Silver Ridge Public Library. The foundation had sent equipment in advance, nothing fancy, just a mounted webcam, a mic, and a small LED light. Elise showed up to help her set everything up, and they tested sound levels while Samson snoozed in the corner, utterly unimpressed. The process wasn't complicated. Clara would be interviewed remotely by various volunteers, some veterans, some researchers, some just curious civilians. All of it would be recorded, archived, and made available in a publicly accessible database designed to broaden the scope of American military memory. Her first interviewer was a young woman named Natalie, a graduate student in Colorado studying the intersection of gender and warfare. She had read the Daily Chronicle article and had a list of questions, but what Clara appreciated most was how genuinely Natalie listened. The conversation started with Clara's early days, why she'd joined, what the first weeks of training were like, how it felt to be the only woman in her unit for almost 2 years. Clara didn't embellish. She told it plainly. The sweat, the blisters, the sideways glances, the locker room jokes that were never quite jokes. She talked about the first time she was given a weapon and how she didn't feel power or fear, just responsibility. She described her first deployment and the heat of the desert, the grit that got into everything, the way time folded in on itself during long missions where every second could stretch like taffy or snap like a twig. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, she spoke like someone who had carried these stories in her bones for decades and had finally been asked to share the weight. And when Natalie asked about Marissa, Clara paused only for a breath before she answered. She didn't offer details she hadn't made peace with, but she didn't flinch from the pain either. She said Marissa had been the best leader she'd ever served under, and the best friend she'd ever had. She said the world lost something irretrievable when Marissa died. And then she said nothing for a long while, and Natalie, wisely, didn't try to fill the silence. When the interview ended, Clara sat alone in the studio for a moment longer, staring at the camera light as it dimmed. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been unbearable either. It had been necessary. She felt something subtle inside her settle, as if a puzzle piece long missing had finally clicked into place. She wasn't just remembering. She was reclaiming. The following weeks brought more interviews, more connections, more stories told and heard. Some were raw, some were weary. A few were even funny in their own dark way. Clara never rushed. She never judged. She treated every conversation like a sacred exchange, and in doing so, she helped others feel brave enough to speak. Word spread quickly. Soon, veterans from other states were requesting to have Clara as their interviewer, not because she was famous, but because she understood. Truly understood. She knew what it was to carry silence like armor, and she knew how to set it down. But even as the interviews became a regular part of her life, Clara never let them consume her. She still took long walks with Samson, still baked cornbread for the church luncheons, still checked on the elderly woman down the road who refused to use a cell phone. Fame had touched her doorstep, but it hadn't rearranged her furniture. Her life, for all its sudden reach, remained grounded. And yet, she had become something else now, something more. A witness, a keeper of stories, a living ledger of unspoken truths. And while she had not asked for the role, she bore it with the same quiet integrity she had always shown, not because she needed to be remembered, but because forgetting had never been an option. Winter crept into Silver Ridge like a careful guest, not with a storm, but with a hush. The trees surrendered the last of their leaves, and a thin frost kissed the rooftops before the sun could shake it off each morning. Clara felt the shift in her bones before she noticed it in the world around her. The ache in her left knee came earlier in the day, and her shoulders tensed against the cold without thinking. Still, she welcomed the season. There was something about the stillness that suited her. Less movement, more listening, and longer hours to write by the fire with Samson curled by her feet. Her notebook, once an idle space for to-do lists and memories she wasn't ready to say aloud, had become a faithful companion, each page filled with fragments from her interviews, personal reflections, and quiet questions she didn't need answered to keep writing them down. She wasn't writing a memoir. She didn't think of herself that way. She was building a map, one that might help someone else find their way through the dark. By now, the oral history sessions had picked up in number and depth. What began as a quiet experiment had grown into a movement of sorts. More veterans were coming forward, especially women who had long convinced themselves that their stories didn't count because no one had ever asked to hear them. Clara didn't need to coach them. She simply showed up, her presence alone often enough to unlock what had been buried. One afternoon, she sat with a woman named Karima, a former Air Force translator who had served in Afghanistan and lost her hearing in an IED blast. Karima had never spoken publicly about her service. She used a speech-to-text program now and typed her story slowly, her words appearing on Clara's screen in soft staccato rhythm. Clara watched the sentences unfold in silence and typed her responses just as carefully. What began as a stiff exchange turned into something tender. By the end of the session, Karima wrote simply, "Thank you for not rushing me. This is the first time I've felt like a soldier since I came home." Clara stared at those words for a long time before typing back, "You never stopped being one." Not every interview was emotional. Some were procedural, even dry, full of dates and ranks and places half erased by time. But Clara found meaning in all of it, in the way people remembered things they hadn't thought about in years, in the way their eyes shifted when they spoke of home or loss or camaraderie. There was a kind of truth that emerged in the spaces between what was said and what wasn't. Clara knew that space intimately. It was where she had lived for years. Her growing visibility brought new invitations. Some she accepted, others she politely declined. A national talk show wanted her for their Veterans Day special, but she passed. She wasn't interested in sound bites. A publishing house reached out, offering a book deal, but Clara turned that down too. She didn't want her life to be edited into a product. What she did say yes to was an invitation to speak at the National Military Women's Summit in early spring. Not as a keynote, but as part of a panel on legacy and visibility. She liked that word, visibility. It wasn't about fame. It was about being seen for who you were, not what others imagined. As the holidays approached, Clara received more mail than she had in the past 10 years combined. Cards from strangers, letters from veterans' families, drawings from school children. One envelope contained only a photo, faded and torn at the edges, of a young black woman in uniform, smiling wide against a chain-link fence. On the back was written, "Her name was Elena. I served with her in '89. You reminded me of her. Thank you for keeping the door open for those who followed." Clara held that photo like it was something holy. She framed it and placed it on her bookshelf beside Marissa's pin. But not all attention was reverent. One morning, a local radio host made a careless remark during a live broadcast, referring to Clara as, "that lady soldier with a sympathy medal." The backlash was swift and unapologetic. Veterans groups, listeners, and even the station's sponsors condemned the comment. The host issued a formal apology within 24 hours, but Clara didn't acknowledge it publicly. She didn't need to. The community had done the defending for her. Still, it left a mark, not because it hurt, but because it reminded her how easily progress could be undermined by ignorance. She didn't blame the man. She blamed the silence that had lasted so long it had given people like him no reason to know better. And so, she kept speaking. Not louder, but clearer. The most surprising development came one snowy afternoon when she received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They were launching a pilot program designed to improve mental health support for older veterans, especially women, who often slipped through the cracks of standard outreach. They wanted Clara to consult, not as a therapist, but as someone who understood what wasn't in the manuals. Someone who could help build a framework that felt less like bureaucracy and more like belonging. Clara agreed, with one condition, that they build in flexibility for storytelling as a form of healing. Not every wound needed medication. Some needed a listener. To her surprise, the program director agreed. That evening, she sat in front of her fireplace, the warmth licking the chill from her skin, and read through the proposal they'd sent her. It was full of acronyms and policy terms, but the bones were good. It was a start. She closed the folder and stared into the fire for a long while. Samson, sensing her thoughts, nudged her foot until she reached down to scratch behind his ears. She thought about how far she'd come, not just from the battlefield, but from that ordinary Tuesday morning in the hardware store, when a young man's laugh had reignited a chain of memory that could no longer be silenced. She remembered that moment vividly, the way the clerk's snicker had rippled through the store, the way the customers nearby hadn't said a word, the way the Medal of Honor tattoo on her forearm had been the only thing that interrupted the assumption, that broke the rhythm of dismissal. It hadn't been the medal that shocked them. It had been the realization that they had overlooked someone worthy of reverence. That realization, she knew now, was not just theirs to feel, it was hers to shape. Clara stood from her chair and walked to the mirror in the hallway. She turned her arm slowly, letting the firelight dance across the ink that had faded only slightly over the years. She remembered the pain of getting it, not from the needle, but from the reason. She had done it not to flaunt the medal, but to remind herself that what she carried was real, earned, and unforgettable. Now, it reminded others too. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it was changing. In her small town, in the interviews, in the stories being archived, in the classroom essays, in the policies being rewritten with her quiet input. And it all began the moment someone finally asked, "What's her story?" The snow thickened over Silver Ridge through January, layering rooftops and blanketing the sidewalks until the entire town looked dipped in silence. It was during one of those snowbound afternoons that Clara received a letter unlike the rest, not typed, not fanfare, not from a government office or foundation. It came in a plain envelope, the address handwritten with careful strokes, like each letter mattered. No return name, just a P.O. box number from a town in Arizona. Clara opened it slowly, seated at her kitchen table where the light from the window barely reached. The letter inside was brief but arresting. It began with an apology, not one full of excuses, just a clean acknowledgement of something left unsaid for too long. Then came a name, Corporal David Renner, the man she hadn't heard from in almost 3 decades, the last surviving member of the mission that earned her the Medal of Honor. Clara read the letter once. Then again her breath held quiet in her chest. Renner wrote that he'd seen her on a Veterans News feature, just a glimpse of her speaking during the museum interview series. He hadn't known about the medal, or the tattoo, or the fact that anyone still remembered that day in Kunar province. He said he'd buried it, not out of shame, but survival. He'd built a new life, one that didn't ask him to unpack what happened in that gulch, what he saw, what Clara had done. He wrote, "I should have written sooner, but I didn't think I had the right." At the bottom, beneath his shaky signature, he added a line, "If you're willing, I'd like to talk. I think I'm finally ready to remember it out loud." Clara held the letter in her hands long after she'd finished reading, the paper warming slowly from her palms. That name, David Renner, had been tucked into the folds of memory, neither hated nor idolized, just kept safe in the quiet corners of her mind. He had been 24 at the time, barely out of flight school, and terrified. She remembered his eyes, how they darted to her constantly for instruction, how he followed without question even when the bullets started tearing up the earth around them. He was the one who'd refused morphine alongside her, who stayed awake through the third night counting flares, whispering the names of the dead like they were sacred. He had survived, but he had never written. Until now. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the front pocket of her notebook, beside the photo of Marissa, the framed letter from the high school essay contest winner, and a yellowed service patch she'd found cleaning out her attic the month before. Then, after a long breath, she sat down at her desk and wrote back. No preamble, no ceremony, just a yes, rapido. The phone call came 5 days later. It was awkward at first. Renner's voice was gravelly with age and habit, and Clara's had that familiar rasp she never tried to smooth out. They exchanged simple greetings, then fell into silence, both waiting to see who would step forward into the past first. It was Clara who did. She mentioned the mission date. He answered with the call sign. And just like that, the dam broke. Not in a rush of drama, but in slow, measured recollection. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, passing the memory back and forth like something fragile. He remembered details she had long lost. She reminded him of things he had chosen not to carry. There were no tears, just long pauses, soft words, and a growing sense of restoration. By the end of the call, Renner asked if she would consider visiting. He lived near a small town outside Tucson, ran a community garden for disabled veterans, and helped organize storytelling nights at the local rec center. He said the group there could use someone like her. Clara didn't answer right away, but that night she looked up flights to Arizona and circled dates in her calendar. Something in her stirred, less urgency, more instinct. Like a gate had quietly unlatched and it was time to walk through. Her trip was scheduled for mid-February, and word of it spread quickly. The Silver Ridge paper ran a short column titled, "Henderson to visit fellow veteran who served with her in decorated mission." The headline made her cringe, but she understood the necessity. Her visit wasn't about reunion, it was about witnessing. Not just for Renner, but for all the others who sat on the edges of memory unsure if it was safe to speak. When Clara arrived in Arizona, the air was dry and warm, and the sky stretched wider than she remembered skies could. Renner met her at the gate, his back stooped slightly, but his eyes unmistakable. They embraced, not tightly, but with the caution of two people who had once stared down death together and lived to carry the weight. The next few days unfolded in a gentle rhythm. She toured the garden, met the veterans in his group, and sat in on a storytelling circle that lasted nearly 4 hours. The stories weren't rehearsed or polished. They were raw, real, and sometimes delivered through tears or with fists clenched. Clara didn't speak that first night. She just listened. And by the end, 3 women had approached her, asking to talk privately. One of them handed her a notebook filled with letters she'd written to a sister who never came home. On her final night there, Renner invited her to sit by the fire pit behind his small house. The desert cooled quickly after sunset, and they both wrapped themselves in old army blankets and watched the embers crackle. Renner, without preamble, spoke of the final minutes of that mission. He described how he'd seen her pull a body from the wreckage, how he'd watched her wipe blood from a man's eyes even as her own leg bled through her fatigues. He said her name was the last thing he'd heard before blacking out, and the first thing he'd asked for when he woke. Then he said something Clara hadn't expected. "I tried to forget, but forgetting didn't bring peace. You speaking out, it did." Clara didn't answer right away. She reached for a stick and stirred the fire, watching the ash rise. Then she said, "It's not peace I'm after. It's clarity. I want the truth to sit in the open, not buried in shadows." Renner nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then I think you're doing more good than you know." The next morning, she left with a satchel of gifts, a jar of wild honey from the garden, a bundle of letters from the storytelling group, and a small pin shaped like a desert flower, a token of thanks from the Veterans Center. As her plane lifted off the tarmac, Clara looked down at the patchwork of sand and sky and felt something settle inside her. Not closure, there was no such thing, but alignment. A life once fragmented now had shape. Back in Silver Ridge, the frost was starting to thaw, and Clara, for the first time in her life, felt herself thawing too, not erasing the pain, but opening the door to let light in. By the time spring unfurled across Silver Ridge, Clara had become something of a fixture in both local and national circles, not in the celebrity sense, but as a name that carried weight in quiet places. She was no longer just a symbol. She had become a reference point. Her story, once a flicker of interest, sparked by a single moment at a hardware store, had threaded itself into the national conversation about visibility, veterans, and the silent architecture of sacrifice. Still, Clara herself remained largely untouched by the grandeur of it all. She refused to be polished into a figurehead, resisting any attempts to turn her experience into a brand. She kept walking Sampson every morning, planting bulbs around her mailbox, attending local potlucks with cornbread in hand, and boots dusted with honest work. But the world kept inviting her forward, and she, without seeking it, kept accepting. Her visit to Arizona had not only reconnected her with Corporal Renner, but had opened a floodgate among other veterans who had served quietly in the shadows. The storytelling initiative grew rapidly, branching out to include monthly virtual meetups and regional workshops. Clara, though initially hesitant, had now taken on a more central role, not leading from a podium, but through presence. She became a facilitator of safe spaces, a quiet nod of permission for people to remember out loud. Her words, always measured, always direct, became something like a lantern for those who had wandered in silence too long. And what astonished her most was that people listened, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because her honesty carried no agenda, only an invitation to see things as they really were. In early March, Clara received an unexpected call from a producer at a national television network. They were launching a docuseries about unrecognized veterans and wanted to dedicate an entire episode to her journey, not just her medal, but the broader implications of how society often misses the heroes standing quietly among them. The producer, a woman named Ava Morales, was persuasive without being pushy. She'd done her research. She referenced the interview Clara had done with Natalie months ago, the initiative with the VA, even a quote Clara had given to a local high school paper about responsibility being the true measure of valor. Ava didn't want drama. She wanted truth. Clara, skeptical at first, asked for time to think. Then, after a long walk with Sampson through the fog-wrapped fields behind her house, she said yes, with one condition. The episode would highlight not just her, but also 3 other veterans from the oral history program who had never been publicly acknowledged. Ava agreed without hesitation. Filming began a few weeks later, and to Clara's relief, the crew was small, respectful, and deeply professional. They followed her on a normal day, walking the dog, organizing her notes, preparing for a virtual interview. They filmed her sitting in her garden, recounting memories of her deployment, not with grandeur, but with careful consideration. At her insistence, they also visited the veterans' shelter she supported, interviewed Elise, and captured the rhythm of life in Silver Ridge as it pulsed quietly beneath the surface. Clara made it clear she didn't want dramatized reenactments or background music meant to stir false emotion. "Let the silence speak," she told Ava. "That's where the truth lives." The other 3 veterans featured in the segment included a nurse from the Gulf War who had documented unsanctioned trauma care during shelling, a trans-Navy engineer who had been forced into early retirement, and a black female sniper who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan without ever receiving public acknowledgement. Each of them shared their truth on camera, and Clara sat quietly during their interviews, nodding, offering comfort where needed, never interrupting. What connected them wasn't the nature of their service, but the invisibility that followed it. The episode aired in mid-April. Clara didn't watch it live. She took Samson out for a long walk instead, skirting the edge of town where the creek ran full with thawed snow. She didn't need to see herself on screen. She had already lived the story, but her phone buzzed nonstop in her pocket. Messages from fellow veterans, students, reporters, strangers who had seen something in her silence that resonated deeply. When she finally sat down that evening and watched the episode with Elise, she was surprised to find that Ava had honored every request. The footage was raw and beautiful, filled with long pauses, spoken courage, and faces weathered not just by war, but by the years spent being overlooked. It wasn't just a documentary, it was a mirror. The public response was overwhelming. Donations to the veterans' shelter tripled. 2 universities reached out to discuss launching oral history programs based on Clara's format. High school students from across the country sent letters, some asking questions, some sharing family stories, all signed with gratitude. One girl wrote, "Before I saw your story, I thought soldiers were only strong if they never talked about what hurt. Now I understand that speaking takes more strength than silence." Clara pinned that one on her refrigerator, beside the grocery list and a reminder to refill Samson's flea meds. But perhaps the most unexpected ripple came from within Silver Ridge itself. The hardware store where everything had begun invited Clara to speak at their company retreat, not for press, but for learning. They had launched a sensitivity and veterans awareness training program, using Clara's story as a case study in unconscious bias. When she arrived, the same young man who had once laughed at her military discount request greeted her with a firm handshake and a quiet apology. Not rehearsed, not performative. Clara smiled and said, "It's not about the past, it's about what you do next." And he nodded, understanding that forgiveness was not the erasure of memory, but the planting of new behavior. Even her relationship with the town began to shift in subtle ways. People stopped treating her like a local curiosity or a topic of whispered reverence. They began inviting her into conversations about policy, about youth programs, about the future. Clara didn't seek to be a leader, but she had become one simply by showing up again and again with consistency and grace. When the mayor asked her to co-chair the town's Memorial Day Planning Committee, she agreed, on the condition that the event include not just a roll call of the fallen, but an open mic for living veterans to speak. "The living carry the stories," she said. "Let's give them space to tell them." That spring, Clara also started receiving letters from young women enlisting for the first time, some entering officer school, others joining the infantry or pursuing engineering programs. They shared their hopes and fears, often ending their notes with, "I saw you speak, and now I believe I belong." Clara responded to each one, handwritten, no shortcuts. She kept a file labeled "Future Soldiers" in her desk drawer, not to hold on to praise, but to remind herself that visibility, when rooted in humility, could be contagious in the best possible way. And though she had never asked to become anyone's example, she embraced the responsibility with the same quiet conviction that had carried her through war zones, through silence, through the long years of being unseen. She wasn't perfect. She didn't want to be. but she was present, accounted for, willing. And in the slow bloom of spring, with the lilacs pressing through the soil and the town finally seeing itself reflected in her resilience, Clara Henderson stood exactly where she was meant to be, not ahead of anyone, not behind, but beside them, walking forward, one truth at a time. By the time Memorial Day arrived in Silver Ridge, the town had undergone a quiet but unmistakable transformation. It wasn't that the buildings had changed or that new monuments had been built, though a plaque honoring local veterans was indeed installed near the courthouse, but rather that a shift had occurred in the collective conscience of the community. People no longer lowered their voices when speaking about service, no longer assumed that age or gender or silence meant insignificance. Conversations about the military had evolved beyond parades and folded flags. Now they included stories of those who had returned and lived full lives, some loudly, some in near invisibility, but all deserving of acknowledgement. Clara had not intended to ignite such a shift, but she had accepted it, nurtured it, and ensured it grew beyond just herself. That year's Memorial Day ceremony was unlike any the town had held before. Under Clara's co-leadership, the program was restructured not only to honor the fallen, but to give space for living veterans to share reflections, in their own words, unfiltered and unpolished. A canopy was set up in the town square, surrounded by folding chairs that filled quickly as residents gathered, many bringing lawn blankets and thermoses of coffee. There was no marching band this year. Clara had gently suggested that silence would be more powerful. The names of the fallen were read slowly, deliberately, with a bell rung after each. Then came the open mic, a podium set not at the front but among the crowd, intentionally lower than the steps of the courthouse, so that no one would feel elevated above the others. It was a symbol, like so much of what Clara did, subtle, unspoken, but deeply meaningful. The first person to step forward was a man in his 70s, wearing a faded green jacket and a ball cap that bore the insignia of the Vietnam War. He spoke briefly of a friend who hadn't made it home, and then, hesitantly, about his own struggle to feel worthy of the life he'd built afterward. His voice cracked only once. The crowd didn't clap. They nodded, stood in silence, a shared current of respect moving among them. After him came a young woman, barely 20, home on leave from basic training. She spoke with trembling hands about the pressure to prove herself, and how stories like Clara's had reminded her that strength comes in many forms. Then came a middle-aged man who hadn't spoken publicly in decades, and a grandmother who revealed she'd served in Korea as a nurse, but had never listed it on her resume because no one ever asked. Clara sat near the back with Samson curled beside her feet, listening as the voices filled the square one by one. She didn't take the mic. Not yet. This space, she believed, belonged to them now, to the people who had carried their silence like armor and had finally found the courage to lay it down. She simply watched, her eyes occasionally wet with unshed tears, her heart full in a way medals could never match. When the ceremony ended, people lingered. Children played near the fountain. Neighbors embraced without pretense. Stories continued in soft circles, off mic, but no less powerful. Later that evening, Clara stood by the new plaque at the courthouse, reading the names etched in brass. Among them were names she recognized, Marissa's among them. She reached out and traced the letters with her fingers, not as a goodbye, but as a quiet promise. She had kept the memory alive. She had told the truth, and the world, or at least her corner of it, had finally listened. That same week, Clara received an invitation from a National Archive institution in Washington, D.C. They were curating a special exhibit titled The Other Side of Valor, and wanted Clara's Medal of Honor tattoo photographed as part of an interactive display on visual memory. The request caught her off guard. She had never considered her tattoo as anything more than a personal reminder, but the curator explained how symbols often tell deeper stories than the words attached to them. Clara hesitated, then agreed on the condition that the photo be accompanied by a caption she would write herself. No embellishments, no dramatization, just the truth. She wrote, "This ink is not for attention. It is not a declaration of heroism. It is a reminder, to myself, first and foremost, that what I carry is real and what I lost is sacred. Some memories are invisible. This one isn't." The exhibit went live in early June and quickly became one of the most visited installations at the museum. Visitors stood in silence before the image, reading the caption, often pausing for long stretches before moving on. Veterans left small notes beneath the display. Some placed their own dog tags in tribute. School groups included it in essays. A ripple effect once again, all rooted in one woman's choice not to remain invisible. Meanwhile, back in Silver Ridge, Clara's life continued in its simple rhythm. She taught a weekly writing workshop at the library now, mostly attended by older women who had stories of their own tucked away in journals or kept quiet behind weary smiles. She didn't teach them how to write, she taught them how to trust their voice. The sessions were filled with laughter, tears, and occasional moments of profound silence, when someone finally released a memory that had lived unspoken for far too long. Clara believed healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about making peace with remembering. Her garden bloomed fuller than ever that summer, and she often hosted Sunday lunches on her porch, surrounded by neighbors, students, and fellow veterans who had become like family. Elise joined often, sometimes with new interview materials, sometimes just with wine and stories from her photo shoots. Their friendship had deepened into something sisterly, a bond forged not just in shared projects but in mutual respect and lived vulnerability. And though her calendar now included more travel, panels, interviews, advisory board meetings, Clara never let it consume her. She made space for silence, for walks, for handwritten letters, for watching the sunset with Samson curled beside her, both of them older, both still finding purpose in the present. But even as the world continued to embrace her story, Clara never mistook visibility for completion. She knew there would always be more work to do, more voices to uplift, more false narratives to challenge. Recognition was not the end. It was a door. One she intended to keep open. That summer, she received a message from a young veteran named Ruby, who had recently come out as gay and had been discharged under outdated regulations. Ruby wrote that seeing Clara's interviews had given her the courage to tell her story publicly and begin working with advocacy groups to reform military inclusion policies. Her email ended with this line, "I didn't think there was room for someone like me in the history books. Now I'm writing my own chapter." Clara printed the message and pinned it on her corkboard above her writing desk. Next to it, she tacked a sticky note that simply said, "Keep the door open." She would, always. By the time autumn touched down on Silver Ridge again, with its auburn trees and golden hush, the echoes of Clara's story had reached farther than she ever imagined. Yet she still rose before the sun, still made her coffee black, still knelt in the garden to trim the lavender, even as the cool air teased her fingers. Life, for all its growing visibility, remained grounded in ritual. She found peace in that balance. The world may have started to call her name with more frequency. Emails from foundations, invitations to keynote conferences, panels about national defense and legacy, but Clara always returned home the same way she had left it, unadorned, intentional, and quietly resolute. There was no ego in her presence, but there was gravity, the kind that made people pause before interrupting, the kind that softened cynics and stirred people into listening just a little longer. She didn't preach, she didn't pose, she didn't pretend. She simply lived her truth so clearly that it gave others permission to do the same. The younger veterans, who now flooded her inbox and joined her writing groups, saw her not as a flawless hero, but as a mirror of possibility. They came from every background, queer, rural, urban, immigrant, disillusioned, and found in Clara's resilience a lifeline to their own quiet strength. One of them, A 26-year-old Marine named Kayla had spent nearly 2 years spiraling in the aftermath of a traumatic convoy incident. She had never spoken of it. Her VA therapist had tried, her partner had begged, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't until she attended one of Clara's public forums, Service, Silence, and the Stories Between, that something shifted. Clara hadn't even spoken directly to her. She'd simply recounted how healing begins, not when pain ends, but when we let pain belong. Kayla approached her after the talk, hands shaking, and whispered just one word: "Same." Clara, without fanfare, squeezed her arm and said, "Whenever you're ready." 3 weeks later, Kayla emailed her first full story. And now, a month later, Kayla had begun working as a facilitator for the next regional oral history group in Maine. These were the consequences of being seen, Clara realized. Not the attention, not the applause, but the awakening it caused in others. It wasn't about legacy in the traditional sense. She didn't care if people remembered her name. But she cared deeply if they remembered that stories like hers existed. That for every woman who returned home wearing silence like a second skin, there might be a community waiting to listen if someone like Clara had lit the path first. Still, visibility came with its burdens. Not all of them were heavy, but they required tending. Clara had been approached by a major military publishing house asking to license her story for a full biography, one with mass-market reach and a ghostwriter with bestsellers under their belt. The offer was generous, the timeline manageable, the exposure potentially global. But Clara read the proposal twice and declined. She didn't want her life cut into neat chapters with commercial titles. She preferred the messiness of memory, the jagged lines of healing that didn't sell well on glossy paper. She agreed instead to publish a small, co-authored volume with a handful of women from her oral history group. Not her biography, their mosaic. A chorus of truths, woven together, offered not to sensationalize, but to testify. The book was titled Undressed Valor: Voices from the Other Side of Silence. It launched at a quiet bookstore in Denver, with little promotion, and yet the room was packed. Veterans, spouses, social workers, students, journalists, strangers, all standing shoulder to shoulder, tears shining, hands held, voices trembling with thank yous too long delayed. The stories inside were raw. They didn't follow a heroic arc. They spoke of anger, confusion, estrangement, hope, redemption, and Clara, seated near the back again, just listened as others took the mic. The applause wasn't for her, but it echoed from her courage. Naki. In the months that followed, Undressed Valor became part of military ethics curricula at several universities. Professors emailed her to say students wept during classroom discussions, not because the stories were tragic, but because they were unvarnished. Clara responded with simple gratitude and continued working on a digital archive for veterans whose stories had yet to be told. She called it the Ledger, a term borrowed from her training days, a record of truths. No ranks, no edits, no reward systems, just the facts of someone's lived experience, honored without correction. One particularly unexpected recognition came when she was invited to the White House Veterans Roundtable as a civilian advisor, not for the medal, not for her combat history, but for her contributions to post-service integration and narrative therapy for underrepresented vets. She sat at a long table flanked by generals and directors, lawmakers and scholars. They introduced her formally, read her resume aloud, referenced her viral story. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, placed her palms on the table and said, "If you're not building systems where the silent feel welcome to speak, you're not honoring service. You're managing it. That's the difference between reverence and protocol." There was a pause. Then quiet nods, some scribbled notes, some stared. No one argued. She flew home that night to Samson, who waited at the porch with Elise, who'd made lentil soup and poured a glass of Pinot like it was just another Thursday, which, in Clara's world, was exactly what it was. Another day lived well. Another truth held gently. But beneath the steady rhythm of her routines, something deeper began to stir. A sense that her journey was turning toward its next bend. Not an ending, but a new beginning. It was sparked by a letter, again. This time from a military high school in Chicago. A history teacher there had created a new elective class called Women Who Served, and Clara's story had become the opening lesson of the semester. The letter was co-signed by 20 students who had watched her interviews and read excerpts from Undressed Valor. They each wrote a paragraph explaining what they had learned. One boy ended his note with, "I never thought about war as something women could carry in silence. I won't forget now." Clara sat on her porch reading those letters as dusk melted into night, the crickets humming, the breeze moving soft through the trees. She thought about all the women she'd interviewed, all the truths she'd carried, all the dismissals she'd endured, all the doors she'd held open, not with force, but with presence. And she realized this: the most powerful legacy wasn't a medal, a book, or even a monument. It was the changed mind of a 17-year-old boy who now understood that silence doesn't mean absence, and that respect should never have to be demanded to be deserved. She closed the letters, leaned back in her chair, and let the stars arrive without ceremony. Somewhere deep in the stillness, Clara Henderson smiled. Not because she had won, but because she had witnessed the world take one honest breath closer to who it could become. The early days of October carried a golden stillness over Silver Ridge, the kind that made the mornings feel suspended in time. The trees shed their leaves slowly this year, almost reluctantly, as if savoring the season before surrendering to winter. Clara noticed everything more acutely now: the way the frost clung longer to her front steps, the hush before the school bell echoed through the town square, the quiet hush of her own breath in the early hours before sunrise. She had never felt younger, but she had never felt more alive. And while her name now floated through articles, classrooms, and veteran circles like a known landmark, Clara moved through her days with the quiet anonymity of someone whose true reward was simply the integrity of having spoken her truth. The work never slowed, though it changed in form. In recent months, Clara had partnered with Elise and a small team of volunteer coordinators to launch the Honor Unseen Initiative, a traveling pop-up exhibit and live oral storytelling series designed to spotlight forgotten veterans in small towns across America. The format was simple. In each town, they would set up a mobile exhibit in a library, community hall, or school gym, and spend a weekend gathering stories, holding open circles, and conducting informal interviews. No press events, no celebrity hosts, just raw, intimate human stories passed from one mouth to another, recorded with care and archived for future generations. Their first 3 cities, Boise, Knoxville, and Santa Fe, had proven that the hunger for honest remembrance was stronger than anyone expected. Veterans who hadn't spoken about their service in 50 years were finally stepping forward. Children wrote poems about parents they barely remembered. Spouses admitted fears and loneliness they'd carried for decades. The experience was both emotionally exhausting and beautifully regenerative. Clara rarely slept more than 4 hours during these weekends. And yet, she never once regretted saying yes to any of them. The 4th stop was scheduled for a coastal town in Oregon, where a small but determined VFW post had been trying to secure funding for a local history archive. Clara arrived on a drizzly Thursday afternoon, her bag heavy with documents, and Samson at her side as always. She was met at the station by a woman named Joan, gray ponytail, army green windbreaker, and a gait shaped by a long-ago injury. Joan didn't say much on the ride to the town center, but her eyes said plenty. Grateful eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much and shared too little. That evening, in a converted church basement filled with folding chairs and donated quilts, Clara addressed a small but attentive group. She didn't tell them her biography. She told them about the first time she buried a friend in silence. She told him about shame, not because she felt it, but because it had been imposed on her. She spoke of invisibility as both wound and weapon, and then she stepped back and let the room breathe. One by one, the townspeople filled the space with their own truth. A man wept, describing his brother's return from Iraq and how he'd never known how to reach him. A mother talked about her daughter's years in silence after serving as a medic. A young woman in her ROTC uniform said she had never felt prouder or more frightened than she did in that moment. And through it all, Clara stood at the edge, taking it in, steady and sure, letting each word settle like a stone in the still water of communal memory. This, she thought, was what justice really looked like, not legal recourse or policy change, though those mattered too, but the simple, radical act of finally being allowed to say, "This happened," and not be dismissed. Clara sat on her porch reading those letters as dusk melted into night, the crickets humming, the breeze moving soft through the trees. She thought about all the women she'd interviewed, all the truths she'd carried, all the dismissals she'd endured, all the doors she'd held open, not with force, but with presence. And she realized this: the most powerful legacy wasn't a medal, a book, or even a monument. It was the changed mind of a 17-year-old boy who now understood that silence doesn't mean absence, and that respect should never have to be demanded to be deserved. She closed the letters, leaned back in her chair, and let the stars arrive without ceremony. Somewhere deep in the stillness, Clara Henderson smiled. Not because she had won, but because she had witnessed the world take one honest breath closer to who it could become. The early days of October carried a golden stillness over Silver Ridge, the kind that made the mornings feel suspended in time. The trees shed their leaves slowly this year, almost reluctantly, as if savoring the season before surrendering to winter. Clara noticed everything more acutely now. The way the frost clung longer to her front steps, the hush before the school bell echoed through the town square, the quiet hush of her own breath in the early hours before sunrise. She had never felt younger, but she had never felt more alive. And while her name now floated through articles, classrooms, and veteran circles like a known landmark, Clara moved through her days with the quiet anonymity of someone whose true reward was simply the integrity of having spoken her truth. The work never slowed, though it changed in form. In recent months, Clara had partnered with Elise and a small team of volunteer coordinators to launch the Honor Unseen Initiative, a traveling pop-up exhibit and live oral storytelling series designed to spotlight forgotten veterans in small towns across America. The format was simple. In each town, they would set up a mobile exhibit in a library, community hall, or school gym, and spend a weekend gathering stories, holding open circles, and conducting informal interviews. No press events, no celebrity hosts, just raw, intimate human stories passed from one mouth to another, recorded with care and archived for future generations. Their first 3 cities, Boise, Knoxville, and Santa Fe, had proven that the hunger for honest remembrance was stronger than anyone expected. Veterans who hadn't spoken about their service in 50 years were finally stepping forward. Children wrote poems about parents they barely remembered. Spouses admitted fears and loneliness they'd carried for decades. The experience was both emotionally exhausting and beautifully regenerative. Clara rarely slept more than 4 hours during these weekends. And yet, she never once regretted saying yes to any of them. The 4th stop was scheduled for a coastal town in Oregon, where a small but determined VFW post had been trying to secure funding for a local history archive. Clara arrived on a drizzly Thursday afternoon, her bag heavy with documents, and Samson at her side as always. She was met at the station by a woman named Joan, gray ponytail, army green windbreaker, and a gait shaped by a long-ago injury. Joan didn't say much on the ride to the town center, but her eyes said plenty. Grateful eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much and shared too little. That evening, In a converted church basement filled with folding chairs and donated quilts, Clara addressed a small but attentive group. She didn't tell them her biography. She told them about the first time she buried a friend in silence. She told them about shame, not because she felt it, but because it had been imposed on her. She spoke of invisibility as both wound and weapon, and then she stepped back and let the room breathe. One by one, the townspeople filled the space with their own truth. A man wept describing his brother's return from Iraq and how he'd never known how to reach him. A mother talked about her daughter's years in silence after serving as a medic. A young woman in her ROTC uniform said she had never felt prouder or more frightened than she did in that moment. And through it all, Clara stood at the edge, taking it in, steady and sure, letting each word settle like a stone in the still water of communal memory. This, she thought, was what justice really looked like, not legal recourse or policy change, though those mattered too, but the simple, radical act of finally being allowed to say, "This happened," and not be dismissed. After the event, Joan walked her back to the guest cabin where Clara was staying. The two women said little until they reached the porch, where Joan paused and said, "I was 17 when I signed up. Lied about my age. They didn't care because I could run farther than anyone else. I did 3 tours, came home with a silver star. You know what my uncle said? He said I probably got it for typing fast." She laughed once, bitterly. "I didn't talk about that for 40 years. Clara looked at her. No judgment, no surprise. Just that quiet, steady presence that invited truth. Joan didn't need permission anymore. She had taken it. And for Clara, that was the most profound kind of victory. The Oregon trip concluded with a bonfire gathering on the beach, attended by over 100 residents. Stories, songs, and silences were shared in equal measure. As the flames cracked against the night sky, someone asked Clara if she ever thought about what her life would have been like if no one had laughed at her that day in the store, if the discount had simply been given and she had walked away unnoticed. Clara stirred the embers with a long stick, then said, "Sometimes I wonder how many lives keep hiding because no one ever challenged the lie that they didn't matter. Sometimes it takes a laugh to start a fire." The group fell into a thoughtful hush. Then someone began humming an old military tune, and others joined. Not because it was rehearsed, because it was remembered. Via Huntwells remembered. Back in Silver Ridge a week later, Clara returned to find her mailbox overflowing. Letters now came from across the globe, military academies in the UK, students in Brazil, women's advocacy groups in South Africa. Some were handwritten, some were typed. Some were children's drawings of medals, uniforms, and smiling faces. All of them, in their own way, bore witness to a woman who had once been mocked in a checkout line and now stood as a lighthouse for so many adrift in silence. She spent her evenings answering each one personally, sometimes writing just a few lines, sometimes filling entire pages. To a girl named Tessa who had been bullied for wearing her mother's old service jacket to school, Clara wrote, "Sometimes they laugh because they don't understand. Sometimes they laugh because they're afraid of what you represent. But keep wearing that jacket. One day, someone will see it, and see you, and remember what courage looks like." As the days grew shorter, Clara began receiving inquiries from public school systems, interested in integrating her materials into social studies and civics curricula. One superintendent proposed a living legacy unit centered around veterans who had changed policy and perception without seeking power. Clara agreed to participate under one condition, that the unit include at least 10 diverse voices and not just from combat roles. "We need to teach kids that service isn't just sacrifice. It's endurance, it's complexity, it's humanity." By now, the Medal of Honor tattoo on her forearm had become an international image of resilience. It was no longer just hers. It had become a symbol for all those who carried burdens that didn't show up in uniform, but weighed just as much. She still rolled down her sleeves sometimes in public, not out of shame, but out of peace. She didn't need to explain anything anymore. The story had been told. The truth had been heard. And the silence had finally, irrevocably, been broken. The wind carried a sharper chill now, brushing in from the north as November settled into Silver Ridge. Clara had switched from light denim to a heavier canvas coat, her sleeves rolled down, collar popped against the early frost. Samson, older and moving a bit slower, still trotted beside her with determined loyalty. The morning walks remained their shared ritual, a quiet space before the day's voices returned, before the messages and interviews, the invitations and expectations. But now, as frost clung to fence posts and chimney smoke curled into the pale sky, Clara felt something more than just the season changing. It was as if something internal had shifted, a deep cellular hum she couldn't quite name. She was not tired. She was not finished. But she was approaching a point of handoff, as if the torch she'd carried, reluctantly, quietly, steadfastly, was almost ready to be passed. The signs were subtle, but she noticed them all. The last event she attended in person had been in Tallahassee, a panel discussion about reforming the process of veteran recognition in underserved communities. It had gone well, emotional, productive, even a few policy leads emerging from it, but when Clara returned home, she'd needed 3 full days of silence. Not exhaustion exactly, more like deep recalibration, as if her soul were asking her to pause, to listen to a quieter calling forming just beneath the surface. That calling wasn't to stop, not completely, but to shift. She'd planted enough seeds. Perhaps it was time to nurture a different kind of soil. But life, as it always had with Clara, had its own rhythm. The week after her return, she received a letter from an Air Force veteran named Rosa, who had just been elected mayor of a small city in New Mexico. Rosa had built her campaign around transparency, community resilience, and veterans reintegration. Her entire staff had been shaped by Clara's story. "You were the reason I ran," Rosa wrote. "I thought if one woman could change the way a town listened, maybe I could change the way a town leads." Clara sat with that letter for a long time, unsure how to hold the weight of that responsibility. It was never her goal to inspire political action, but the ripple effect of truth was never something one could fully predict. What she could do, however, was support Rosa the best way she knew how, by showing up. Quietly. With guidance, not spotlight. She offered to mentor Rosa's team on developing a local storytelling initiative similar to Honor Unseen, tailored to their region's unique demographics. She helped them build templates, connect with oral historians, and create safe spaces for veterans, refugees, and first responders to share experiences often kept behind closed doors. No cameras, no headlines, just trust, the same formula that had worked everywhere else. As she worked remotely with Rosa's team, Clara found herself increasingly drawn to the mentorship aspect of her work. She began accepting fewer interviews in public events, choosing instead to invest in one-on-one relationships with emerging leaders, many of them women, many of them people of color, many of them fighting battles within systems that still resisted uncomfortable truths. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. She didn't frame herself as a guru. She just listened, offered reflection, asked better questions. Slowly, she watched these women grow into forces of nature in their own right. And in them, Clara saw a future where she wouldn't have to keep repeating her story, because they would carry forward the legacy in their own voices, with their own scars and victories stitched into every word. Yet even in this season of quiet mentorship, the world continued to send unexpected moments of public acknowledgement. One afternoon in late November, Clara received a package from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Inside was a formal letter inviting her to donate her old service boots and the original transcript from her first recorded oral history session to a permanent exhibit titled The Hidden Frontline: Stories of Courage Beyond the Battlefield. Clara sat holding those boots, weathered, dusty, still holding the shape of her steps, and remembered the long nights, the weight of her gear, the ache in her knees, the silence in her chest. She didn't hesitate. She filled out the donation form, added a brief statement, and shipped the box the next morning. Another piece of her past released into the world, not to be glorified, but to be remembered. That same week, a local artist named Milo approached her with a proposal. He had been working on a mural that would span the length of a wall near the town's library, depicting the history of Silver Ridge through layered vignettes. He wanted to include Clara, not as a portrait but as a motif. "I see you as the spine of the story," he said, "not the face, the thread." She considered it and smiled. "Only if you include others too. Marissa, Joan, Elise, the woman from Boise who told her truth with shaking hands." Milo agreed, and together they curated a collage of silhouettes, hands, dog tags, open mouths mid-sentence, boots left on a doorstep. The mural would not name names. It would not explain. It would simply speak. And then came Thanksgiving, a day Clara had often spent alone by choice, enjoying the quiet. But this year, she accepted Elise's invitation to join a growing table of misfits and storytellers, veterans and students, volunteers and neighbors. Samson curled beneath the table, collecting crumbs, while Clara found herself laughing more freely than she had in months. It felt like a soft landing, a reminder that service didn't always look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looked like showing up with pie and listening to someone else's story unfold. As the fire crackled and conversations melted into the low hum of comfort, Elise leaned toward her and asked, "Do you ever think about what's next? Not the work, but for you?" Clara took a long sip from her cider and looked around the room, at the young man reading a poem to his mother, at the woman in the corner sketching silently, at the teenager nervously recounting her first protest. She nodded slowly. "I think maybe it's time to stop speaking and start writing. Something for myself, something quieter." Elise smiled, understanding more than words could express. "The world will still hear you," she said, "even in silence." That night, as Clara lay in bed, beneath a hand-stitched quilt from a widow in Mississippi she'd never met, she felt something settle inside her. A permission, finally, to rest. Not in the sense of ending, but of evolution. The fire she'd sparked had spread. Others were carrying torches now. The doors were still open, the stories still being told. And she was ready. For what? She didn't entirely know, but ready, nonetheless. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whispered promise. And Clara, hands folded over her chest, whispered back, "Thank you." Winter arrived without fanfare in Silver Ridge, as if the land itself had taken a long exhale. Snow came late but steady, blanketing the rooftops in quiet white, muffling the sound of tires and footsteps, softening the edges of the world. Clara moved more slowly through these colder days, not because of age, but because she had earned the pace. Her steps were intentional, her routines gentle. The phone still rang, the emails still arrived, and the requests continued. Book panels, university keynotes, nonprofit board seats, but she answered only the ones that felt right. The rest she let drift by like snowflakes against the window pane, beautiful, but not essential. She had given the world so much already. It was okay to keep some pieces for herself now. She spent most mornings by the fire, notebook in hand, Samson at her feet, a stack of books on the end table beside her. The journal was not for a memoir, not for any public-facing project. It was just for her. Pages filled with reflections, sketches of dreams, fragments of stories she hadn't yet told. Not because she hadn't had the chance, but because they had never needed to be spoken aloud. They were hers. Private memories tucked between the folds of a life, lived deeply and honestly. She wrote not to be read, but to be remembered by herself. The mural downtown was completed just after the first frost, its colors vivid against the stone wall, even beneath winter's gray skies. The townspeople gathered for a small unveiling. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, just a quiet afternoon where people brought coffee and thermoses. Children traced the painted outlines with mittened hands. and older veterans stood in silence before the painted silhouettes, nodding as if recognizing someone they hadn't seen in decades. Clara didn't speak that day. She didn't stand in front. She lingered near the back, hood up, hands in pockets, watching the mural speak for itself. That was the point. The work was no longer hers. It belonged to the town now, to anyone who passed by and found a piece of themselves in its brushstrokes. The Honor Unseen initiative continued without her direct involvement, led now by 3 former participants who had stepped into leadership roles seamlessly. They expanded the reach, added new regions, and began offering digital story submissions so that even those in remote communities could contribute. Clara remained a quiet advisor, but her name appeared less and less in the press materials. She preferred it that way. She had never wanted to become the face of anything. She had only wanted people to listen, to each other, to themselves, to those they had overlooked. Now that they were listening, truly listening, her voice didn't need to be the loudest anymore. On New Year's Day, Clara took her longest walk of the season, winding up the ridge that overlooked the town. The path was icy but manageable, and she paused often, both to catch her breath and to take in the view. The town below was calm, rooftops nestled beneath white caps, the distant spire of the library barely visible through the trees. She stood at the summit for a long time, not thinking, just being. Samson sat beside her, nose twitching at the wind. Clara reached down and rested a gloved hand on his back, anchoring herself in the stillness. She thought then about legacy, not the kind etched in granite or preserved in textbooks, but the quieter kind, the kind that lived in ripple effects, in a student who chose to ask different questions, in a mother who finally told her son the truth about her service, in a teenager who stopped mocking what he didn't understand, in a town that once laughed and now looked inward instead of away. That was the legacy Clara Henderson had left. Not through a single act, not even through her Medal of Honor, but through her steady, unyielding insistence that truth, unadorned and inconvenient as it often was, deserved to be heard. She made her way back down slowly, arriving home just as the light began to shift into dusk. The house welcomed her like an old friend, warm and quiet. She peeled off her layers, made tea, and sat by the window, watching as the first stars appeared. She thought of Marissa then, thought of all the others. She no longer carried their memory like a wound. It had become something else, something rooted, like the foundation of a home. They had shaped her, and through her, shaped the world in ways they might never know. But Clara knew, and that was enough. That night she began a new journal. On the first page, she wrote only one sentence: "Let what I've built make room for others to rise." Then she set the journal aside and turned off the light. Months later, in the spring, a visitor arrived at her door. A young woman named Layla, just 23, newly out of the military, lost between one life and the next. She had driven 3 states to find Clara. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, "but I read what you wrote, and I needed to believe there was space for someone like me in this world." Clara opened the door wider and gestured her inside. "There's always room," she said. "Come in." They sat for hours, no agenda, no rush, just 2 women, different generations, same weight of silence, talking as the wind moved softly outside. And in that moment, Clara realized her work would never really be finished, but it would always be shared. Raul. In the years that followed, Clara faded from the spotlight entirely. Her story lived on, in classrooms and murals, in archived recordings and whispered conversations between strangers who had learned how to listen. The Medal of Honor tattoo became not just a symbol, but a question, one that people carried with them. Who have we overlooked? Who do we owe a second chance to see clearly? And wherever that question was asked, Clara was there, in spirit if not in name, the spine of the story that had changed 1,000 others. In the final season of her life, Clara no longer sought to prove anything. She lived in presence. She tended her garden. She mentored in quiet corners. She told stories only when asked. And when the time came, peaceful, gentle, without fear, she left the world with the same grace she had carried through it. No headlines marked her passing, no parades, just a handwritten note posted on the library wall that read, "Clara Henderson taught us to listen. Let's not stop now." And they didn't. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.